it's a great honor and privilege to introduce Gerd Korman, Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. And Gerd, you were born in 1928 in Elberfeld in the German Rhineland. Your mother was born in Germany but from East European Jewry, and your father was of Polish descent.
Was mine?
From Poland. His family originated from Poland.
Poland.
And your family then moved to Hamburg, where your brother was born 3.5 years later. And you were our witness to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime, which came to power in 1933. And what's really, really unbelievable is your family was arrested and deported to the Polish border, to the no man's land, on October the 28th. It was on a Friday, October the 28th, 1938. And under extreme conditions, you had to stay in horse stables and in flour mills, and you were there for about a year. During this time, your father managed to return to Hamburg, and through a Christian neighbor and friend, Gisler, he got a passage on the St. Louis, which that ill-fated boat that was en route to Havana in Cuba, and was America didn't allow, and Cuba didn't allow, neither did Canada. No country allowed them to dock, and they had to return. And instead of returning to Hamburg, docked in Antwerp, and your father was then sent to Rotterdam, and he landed up in Westerbork, where he survived miraculously in this terrible transit camp where so many people were deported. But your parents made the most extremely difficult decision, I think both of them made it, that you and your brother would go on the Kindertransport to England, and you went by yourselves on a train to Otwalk near Warsaw, and then you were on the last list, and you were really the last to leave in August, and then you arrived. You had to take a train to you went through Danzig, and then you took a port, and then you went on the train and a boat, and you arrived in Southampton on August the 29th, literally 3 days before the outbreak of Germany's invasion of Poland and the start of the World War and the Shoah. So those children that didn't make that list, unfortunately they remained behind in Poland. But thank God you and your brother were on that list, and you were managed to arrive as a Kindertransport in London, and you were taken to a Jewish family where you were there for a short while, and then there was the evacuation, and you were evacuated to Devon, and then you stayed with a mother and a daughter, Gosling, who were very righteous Gentiles. Amazing, they kept you in this town of in Devon, in Talton, and you stayed there for about a year. And you even organized...
Talton was a village. Devon was a...
Yeah, it was a village in Devon. And you even organized a Seder that you remember for your brother, and there was 2 girls and another boy that you were the one that organized the Seder. You organized the Seder.
Yeah.
You had a Seder there, and they respected your not eating meat, and I think the Gosling were very good to you and your brother. And then a year later, your mother had, by this time, got passage miraculously to America. She got a visa to go to America, and she had already arrived in New York. And then you and your brother went on a train. You also got papers that you could arrive and join your mother. And you went to Glasgow, and then you boarded the Cameronia that sailed to through German submarine and U-boat infested waters, and you arrived in New York under such difficult circumstances, where there were so many ships that were destroyed. They sank from the U-boats. But thank God you arrived, and you reunited with your mother, and then after the war with your father as well. And what you went through, I think you summarized it in your amazing book called The Nightmare's Family Tale, where you mention that that you, when you got to America to recover from a nightmare that you that was executed in broad daylight. Your nightmare was executed in broad daylight. It was in the open. You experienced things. You experienced the Shoah, being evacuated, first of all being deported, being put in prison, and you were arrested, and then going to the no man's land in Poland, and then as a kindertransport. It's just incredible, and how your father being on the St. Louis and being then interned in Westerbork. Your family story about the Shoah is unique and unbelievable. But you made a life for yourself in with your brother and your mother in New York, and you pursued a career in academia. And I would say that you're one of the preeminent scholars and a pioneer, really a pioneer, in establishing the study of Holocaust in American academia. So, Gerd, can I just ask you, what encouraged you, or why did you choose the career of academia, of becoming, getting involved in American history and taking your career to be a teacher and a lecturer and then later professor?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Why did you pursue a career in the academic world of...
Oh, I think by accident. Sort of by accident. Because when my brother and I came to New York to stay with my... she had to earn her living as a housekeeper. And so we couldn't live with her. A fact of life that struck me, at least, very powerfully, because I hadn't anticipated that at all.
It's also, I think the area she lived in wasn't a very Jewish area. She wanted you to be, your mother wanted you and your brother to be in a more Jewish environment.
Well, she had to figure out how to hold on to her job as a housekeeper, place us with a family that could take care of us, deal with one of the American Jewish committees who helped to support her, and she had to by herself find a way of saving enough money from what she earned as a housekeeper in Great Neck, so that we would have a roof over our head. So, from my childhood's perspective, we were boarded out to a Jewish family that my parents had known in New York now, and they were also refugees. So one refugee was dependent on the other refugees, and it was a difficult situation for her.
And you were only 12 at this time?
Yes. A very difficult situation for her. She she had to make all those decisions that somehow kept us in a Jewish household. And lived close enough so she could visit us at least once a week. She was a housekeeper in Great Neck, New York.
We have a picture of you and your brother and your mother in 1943. So your mother was a very courageous lady. She was an incredible...
Pardon?
Your mother was very courageous.
I don't think she thought she was courageous. She was just doing what she thought she should do as a mother. And I thought at the time that she was a very courageous person and that we were extraordinarily lucky. But at the same time, that whole experience was completely unreal. And all I really remember to this day is that my brother and I did our best as children to help her do whatever it is she had to do. For us, certainly for me, the entire experience began with great disappointment because we didn't anticipate coming to New York and being boarded out with strangers. I mean, and all the things we thought about before we got here to greet my mother didn't include any of that. So each moment really was a profound shock. And I guess, as most children do, you ride with the storm. And I can't speak for my younger brother, Manny, because he was, at his age, he perceived a lot of this differently than I did. And whatever I perceived was framed by the fact that I took my responsibility as an older brother very seriously. And that was not because I was born in sainthood, but my mother impressed on me the responsibility of what an older brother had to do. And so whatever I did in relationship to my younger brother was to a large extent shaped by my mother, who returned to her role as a family pedagogue once we were reunited. But it was a very complicated role because I really didn't know where she worked and what she did. I had a vague sense of where she worked and what she did, but I was never really sure. And the older I got, the more concerned I was what she really was doing. But that concern was always sharply contained by a complete trust in my mother, complete, and a full recognition, even at my age at 12, what kind of heroic person she was. And she maintained our familial connection to my father, about whom she now knew very little, because he had started his camp life in Westerbork. And once war broke out, the connection between her and my father essentially broke, kept alive by the Red Cross letters and some other connections sometime. But she, as a child, I remember completely how devoted she was to the family life that she was now leading, and how impossible that family life had become. I mean, she saw us once a week, and she was a housekeeper in a stranger's family. But fortunately, in retrospect, she was a housekeeper in a Jewish household in Great Neck, New York, which meant she was very isolated from Jewish life, because at the time, Great Neck, New York was not the great hub of Jewish life that it became later on. And she was able to find the strength to do, in my judgment, and at the time, and I do really remember thinking about this at the time, extraordinary heroic things. She had a job in Great Neck. She had to find us a place where we were boarded out and comfortable. We weren't always cooperative in that respect. So for a stretch of time, she had to figure out how she could place us somewhere that she could afford and manage and trust. And her first effort didn't work out for one reason or another, and I don't know why. And she then got the help of relatives on her mother's and father's side. Increasingly, though, with the help of relatives from my father's side, who lived on the Lower East Side in New York. Her whole life was built around the 4 hours that she could spend with us once a week. So she had this job in Great Neck, which seemed terribly far removed from me at the time, living in East New York, Brooklyn. And every week, she spent X number of hours on a bus on the subway to make her way from Great Neck to East New York, Brooklyn. There are 24 hours in the day. She had to allocate a lot of those hours to travel from Great Neck, New York to East New York, Brooklyn, and back again, and all within 24 hours.
And at this time, were you at a public school?
Pardon?
Were you at a public school?
Yes, we were in the first family that we were placed with was friendly with my family in Hamburg. I never really learned precisely what the relationship was. And I really think it was a matter of convenience. They needed the money, the refugees themselves, and my mother knew them enough to trust them with her children. That became a fairly tense situation because my brother and I didn't really hit it off with that family. But we were not that far removed from where that family lived in East New York, Brooklyn, to relatives of ours who lived also, not in East New York so much, but a little bit further out on Long Island. And one way or another, I don't know how she managed it, she was able to persuade relatives to take us in, apparently because we were too difficult to manage for the first family, and in particular, I was too difficult to manage. At least that's the impression I gained increasingly. And she had relatives on my mother's side, mother and father's side, who belonged to the big Engelberg family. So, in one way or another, and always with the help of Hayas or some other Jewish committee, she managed to arrange guardianship, informal guardianship for us. In those circumstances, a refugee does what is necessary. So she somehow was able to trust one group of families that were related to us and who owned an apartment building in East New York, Brooklyn. And as owners of an apartment building in East New York, Brooklyn, they had relations with the family that became the janitors in the complex. So somehow, I don't know the details, between my relatives, my mother, and I guess some Jewish agency that must have been involved, she arranged for us to board with these relatives who also lived in East New York, Brooklyn, but further east on Long Island.
And at this time, you had your bar mitzvah?
Pardon?
When you were 13, you had your bar mitzvah?
I had
your bar mitzvah.
Oh.
You remember your bar mitzvah?
Oh yes. Well, all of that took place after she was able to make these arrangements for us. Because these physical arrangements shaped almost everything. and determined almost everything. So the fact that I had a bar mitzvah and my brother had a bar mitzvah afterwards, that came from the fact that my mother had maintained her Jewish connections. And I think under the circumstances, one really has to fully appreciate what that meant. She was a single mother, and I'm describing to you her role as a mother.
Recording in progress.
But relatively speaking, my mother was also a young woman.
Hello?
Whose husband was far away in a concentration camp, who was a refugee among the Jews that she lived with and worked with. That wasn't always a position of prestige. So how she managed all of those situations, her age, her gender, her relation with my father from a distance, I was never privileged to. I mean, the older I got, the more I thought about that. And the more I thought about that, I was in awe, and really in awe, how she had managed her life. And that became ever more powerful once I married and I look back on what she had done. She was a gorgeous woman. You can tell from the photograph. And she maintained the integrity of her family.
And good, did she instill a love of Yiddishkeit, a love of did she instill in you and your brother a love of Yiddishkeit, a love of Judaism?
She what?
Did she instill a love of Judaism, a love of Yiddishkeit?
She maintained yes. Oh, yes.
Would you go to synagogue on Shabbat, or?
Well, we were boarded out with relatives, right? Who were the janitors.
Were they observant?
Complex.
Were they observant, your relatives?
They sell them in the IKEA, right?
They were, as I fully appreciated afterwards,
Okay. So we have to lower it down.
they were
Maybe we can do a half bed.
working class Jews with aspirations to middle class status. He was a janitor in the building where we lived that was owned by relatives. We shared completely in the life of a janitor of an apartment building. He and his wife were janitors, and we were living in the world of janitors. I was old enough to understand that I had come from lower middle class background, German Jewish, East European Jewish background. And I knew the life I was leading was totally out of my memory. Never had anything like it. Never. So I was very conscious of who I was, or who I thought I was. And I was very conscious of who the people were with whom we stayed. And I was very conscious of my place in that life.
Can I ask you, at public school, did you manage to make friends?
Yeah, but wait a minute. The reason I'm going into this a little bit is that it's at the heart of many a refugee's life. The day-to-day activities were shaped by complete strangers. The day-to-day activities were shaped by strangers whose station in life was totally different from what you had known with your own parents. You were in the hands of the family that were doing all kinds of things that appalled you. I came from a lower middle class Jewish family who lived by certain standards and values. And there were certain do's and don'ts that I remembered as a child. And I was now with a family that didn't follow any of those rules and any of those traditions. There was more loud shouting in the apartment that those people lived in as janitors than I had ever heard in my life. So my brother and I shouldn't speak for him because he had to work this out differently. I had to come to terms with, and quickly, with, in retrospect, was a very difficult reality because I was conscious of where I was not. I was conscious I was living in a stranger's household. And I was also conscious, at least so I felt, that I had a deep, deep responsibility of maintaining the memory of my own family, its standards, its forms of ordinary behavior. And in retrospect, I now realize that I designed a whole series of little acts by which I retained my autonomy in this situation. I never, never, never opened the refrigerator door. Because for me, opening that family's refrigerator's door meant something that hadn't happened. My brother, on the other hand, was just younger enough. He opened the refrigerator door without any problems. I never opened the refrigerator door myself. And there are a few other things I did like that, which was my conscious way of keeping my autonomy, of keeping my difference. Because my authority was my mother, who came to visit once a week. She had a day off once a week. So out of that one day, she could spend 4 hours with us, because the other hours in that day, night, she had to travel from where she worked in Great Neck, New York, to East New York, Brooklyn. And she didn't do it by rented car, and she didn't do it by hired car. She did it by buses and subways. So I was always terribly conscious of what she was doing, and always knowing that I don't know who my mother really is now. I mean, who this woman was, whose husband wasn't here, whose husband was in prison somewhere in Europe. And in retrospect, as a student of some of these issues, I came to appreciate what a lot of children came to appreciate. Namely, we were in a totally, totally different world than the one that was planned to us originally. And it was to my parents' credit, I'm sure, that I maintained my connection to Jewish life. Partly because my mother insisted on finding a home that was first recognizable, traditional, Orthodox Jewish, not recognizable, learned Jewish, recognizable, behavioral Jewish. And she did it with a family that she knew in comparison to who she was, relatively ignorant about the world and many other things. We were boarded out by working class janitors who maintained an awareness of Shabbat, but they didn't maintain Shabbat. Ochel Chagim. My brother and I came from a household that was not ultra-Orthodox. I think by American standards, it was a family in Europe, lower middle class, Zionist, traditionally Orthodox in their behavior. My father was a salesman. He was a child of Belzer Hasidim, who was a rebellious child of Belzer Hasidim. So his private life, his personal life, was not the life of a Belzer Husid. It was the life of a lower middle class refugee from Poland trying to make a go of it in Germany, having to deal with German Jewish prejudices and everything that was involved. And he fell in love and married the daughter of East European Jewish parents. Not like his own. His own were Belzer Hasidim. No questions. Very different, and I never met them. But when we got into trouble because of what the Germans were doing, relatives of that family popped up every now and then, so I knew they were trying to help us in one way or another. But I never really got to know them. And I learned to appreciate fully that my father, who had come from Belzer Hasidim, very knowledgeable in Judaica, could read Hebrew, could read Yiddish, but I never really heard him speak Yiddish or Hebrew. When I fell in love with my wife, and he discovered that she was trained in Yiddish, the two of them had a blast. I mean, she spoke Yiddish to him, and he wasn't so fluent in his own Yiddish. I don't know why not. Anyway, he never really spoke it, but they managed beautifully, and he was so proud that I was about to marry someone like that. So the ins and outs of Jewish urban life that I was encountering were really miles apart. And so long as we lived with the Rifkins, with this family, we were in one world that lasted until my father came, because my mother had to board us out. She boarded us out wherever she could, first with relatives, and when that became no longer possible for one reason or another, and I don't know all the reasons, she then had to punt, so to speak. She had to figure out what to do, and then moved heaven and earth to facilitate my father's coming to us as a head of a family.
I think, Gerd, if I could just mention, your mother she knew Albert Einstein, and she asked him if he had any influence to get your father released. But it just shows the connections that your mother...
Well, my mother, who was my mother in that situation? My mother was married to a prisoner of the Germans from 1939 to 1945. Their contact was through Red Cross letters most of the time. And it was a relationship based entirely on memory and expectations in a future that no sane person should ever have entertained. I hope you hear me right, that no person who was sane should have entertained, and yet she entertained it.
Maybe it gave her hope. It gave her the will to continue.
It did what it was necessary for her to live with her children. What she did was for my brother and I. She didn't do it for the maintenance of some ideal abstract marriage. Her focus was on her children. Beginning and end of the story. And to it she added what she could. My father's life, for me, was a secret book. And at one point, as I became a practicing historian, I learned a lot about the circumstances under which he lived and in which he lived and the people he came close to. And I came to understand very clearly. By now I was a married man, children of my own. The circumstances that he had to deal with. Sainthood was not in his daily diary. And he made all kinds of friends. He was separated from my mother for years and years. And how they managed to come together again, for me, was always an amazing event. And the details of which I never knew, of course. But I watched as a much older son when my father's friends from the concentration camp had come to New York. and they formed a kind of social circle, and they would come visit us. And I watched and I saw how my mother had to relate to people who had come very close to each other. It's like, must be somewhat similar to the child of a prisoner who lives in prison and then is released after some 8-9 years, and it goes back to his family. Sometimes they can make it and sometimes they can't. Well, they obviously decided to make it, and they did. She remained devoted, totally devoted. And I think he did too. But he had, after all, been this special prisoner in Camp Westerbork. So I got to know more than I should have known, I think. I got to know a lot about who he was. And he was not just my ordinary father. I mean, he had become a major player among the governing Jewish circles of Camp Westerbork.
Here's just a picture of your father when he was in Westerbork.
Right.
Yeah.
So by the time the war was over, and then these friends got together periodically in New York, I saw and I realized, because by that time I was already an old teenager, that they had relationships that I knew nothing about, and they had relationships that I was pretty sure my mother didn't know anything about. Couldn't possibly have.
And here's a picture with you and your father. There's a striking resemblance between the two of you as well. That
he lived an astounding life in those years, about which I knew very little. But the price you pay as a historian is you learn much more than maybe you want to know about circumstances in which your father lived.
Could you ever ask your father what happened when he was...
Pardon?
Could you ever ask your father, did you feel comfortable ever asking your father about his experiences in Westerbork?
Oh, I did.
And did he open up?
I did. But I was totally aware. This was his world. And I very quickly got to know the fence that stood between us. Well,
Also, Daddy, I'm going to say something here. It was very fresh.
pardon?
Opapa didn't live long enough. He didn't live long enough to get to the point where he could even step back for a minute. I don't think. No, I don't think. Do you know what I mean?
I don't know what you're saying.
What I'm saying is Opapa died relatively young,
Yeah.
right? So, what was it, 15 years after he got out of the camps? Not even. 15,
What, so,
right? 15 years. So I don't... Oh, רק שנייה. So I don't think he had the sometimes it's the time, a lot of time, right? You have all sorts of additional insights as you step further away from experience. And he didn't have that much time to step further away from experience. So it's very, very possible that if we had been old enough to ask him questions, we would have got a lot of information that he wouldn't share with you when he first came out.
Yeah, maybe, but I don't think he did
What?
share with you.
He couldn't. He died.
Oh, he died. He died.
I was 4 or 5 when he died,
Yeah.
right? He couldn't share with us.
Yeah, but as far as I'm concerned, that's almost irrelevant because he didn't share it with me either.
No, but I think he wouldn't. I think a lot of people didn't share,
Well, that's
right?
right.
And only later people began to share more.
Yeah.
There's many cases where many years later they open up.
And
Yeah.
and why?
When it was okay to open up. It wasn't so
and
okay.
why? I got to know this subject very well. Not just within my family. I mean, the literature is full of this kind of tension that Corona is bringing up.
Hello? Hello? Shlomi?
The participants in surviving the Shoah
Hello?
came to terms with the post-Shoah period and each in their own ways.
We have to set.
A good portion of them became fantastic liars, hid the truth from each other, and a portion of them remained incredibly loyal to each other under very difficult circumstances. At the time earlier, I realized I had to decide
Yeah?
what I thought about my father's past. And I reached a point where I knew enough to close the book on it. And the reason I felt I had to do that as a young man is because I learned about his relationship with anti-Hillism. And that relationship was never an intimate relationship. It never was.
This is a picture of Etty Hilderson in 1942.
But simply on the basis of what she wrote in her letters to him, which at one point I studied. It was quite obvious to me, because by that time I was married and had my own children. It was quite obvious to me that for my father and lots of other people like him, they were in a concentration camp situation that allowed them to lead a almost an autonomous life, connected somehow to their past and always connected to a world of liberation. But in the meantime, and it was a big meantime, there were the German occupiers. And in the meantime, there were ordinary people who had ordinary needs they tried to satisfy. They didn't just die inside. I mean, they came to terms with who they were and where they were. And I think I had to come to terms with imagining the past and the future that my father lived with, not mine, his. And when you do that seriously with yourself, you very quickly realize you either respect his privacy or you don't. And given where he was and what his station was, I must say, the older I got, the more critical and frank I came with myself and trying to determine who he was when he went into the camp, who he became while he was in the camp, and who he was when he came out of the camp. And for me this was an important issue because I had become a kind of student of the Shoah. And my father represented a microscopic version of what had been going on in the minds of lots and lots of people. I mean, and I got to know a lot of these people who were friends of my father. So here I am, a professor of history, getting to know, on the way to becoming a professor of history, getting to know my father all over again, and getting to know the people who survived with him. And all the time learning more and more about camp life and their camp life. So I had to come to terms with all kinds of stuff. And I could either close the book on it, or I could pursue it. So I pursued it as long as I could. And fortunately for me, as a trained historian, I was supposed to be able to appreciate the inner life of the stranger. Otherwise, why are you a historian if you can't do that? So that's what I did. And that meant I had to work at 2 or 3 levels of intimacy about my father. I had him very clearly in my own frame of historical analysis, where he was in a complex bureaucracy and a participant in the concentration camp life, where Jews organized themselves and became the tool of the German occupier. And they knew it. And they knew it. And they knew, and they justified it, because they couldn't commit suicide. Some did, because they couldn't manage what they were doing. But people like my father didn't commit suicide. I always kept that up front, because I assumed he didn't commit suicide because he had his family. But I think there was more to it than that. I think there was more to it than that. I think he and quite a number of others worked at a very conscious level in this horribly complicated camp machinery, where they were participants in an occupation. I mean, if you run a barrack in Westerbork, you're part of the machine that's running Westerbork. And you can turn yourself inside out and outside, but that's still exactly what you're doing. And what is your alternative? He left little messages from the time where I came to understand that he knew exactly what his alternatives were. He was committed to surviving, to living, and he was concerned on returning to us, to his family. But he also knew he was carrying suitcases full of information and experiences that wouldn't go anywhere because they could only fit in the situation in which they were produced. I never got to the point with him that I am now talking to you. And I always respected his privacy, which I think probably was a mistake, but I did.
Could you ever ask your mother?
Pardon?
Could you ever approach your mother and ask your mother about your father?
Say again?
Could you ever ask your mother
Yeah.
about her opinion or
No.
what she thought?
No. 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 I drew a very sharp line as a child, as a young man. I only was interested in what they told me. After their death, I started to dig into all kinds of stuff, but never at the time. Never at the time. I don't think I had the courage to do it. And partly I think I assumed they themselves couldn't do it with me.
Again,
I got little hints. Some of which is what you hear so often when you read material from Shoah survivors. So many of them sound so similar to people who were in prison for one reason or another, having nothing to do with the Shoah. They created a world in which they were confined. They were prisoners. I mean, you can dress this up any way you like, but they were prisoners in a German regime. And unlike you and me, they could have a sense of the future that had life in it. They could imagine it, but they also knew the chance of it ending yesterday was always present. In the case of the Westerbork people, the symbols of all of that were caught in the routines of the transports that left Westerbork and headed for Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen or God knows where. No, that's not true. God may not know where. I do. I do. I know where they thought it was going. And they also knew that allowing yourself to go on those transports or volunteering for those transports was tantamount to committing suicide. I mean, it's very difficult for anyone who wasn't involved in this to even get close to this kind of mentality. But that's exactly what most of them did. A few of them had the strength to commit suicide. And they ran to electrified border fences to kill themselves. But most retained the illusion or delusion that where they were somehow they could retain the sense of themselves and live with themselves with survival. I don't know how they did this. I never had any conversation with my father about situations like this. But anyone who has studied, even superficially, this kind of issue must know that each one of those people who survived, not the ones who died, but the ones who survived, ended up living with a reality that was almost impossible to manage. Almost impossible to manage. I got a taste of this only when, at one point or another in a idle conversation, I realized he was telling me that it came close to volunteering to go on transport, which is another way of committing suicide. He was in a position to do exactly that, because he was part of the bureaucracy that was running the camp, and he was part of an original bureaucracy that was running a camp. So he was Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside all the time. And I tried it myself as a historian not to get illusioned, not to be delusioned, not to be tricked by a historical record that you really know is incomplete.
What's amazing is that with Etty Hillesum, she actually did go on the transport.
Pardon?
Etty actually did go on the transport, and then she was killed in Auschwitz.
Hillesum.
Yeah, so she couldn't save herself, and she unfortunately couldn't save herself, even though she was quite...
Etty Hillesum.
Yeah, she went on a transport. She was taken on the transport.
Yeah, yeah.
And she died in Auschwitz.
Well, she's a fascinating figure. No question about it. She's a fascinating figure. And of course she became much more complex and fascinated after she died by what people did with her memory.
They were published. Her letters were published.
Right, right. And my perception of Etty Hillesum, I think, is quite different from most people's. Because if you really dug into her life, then you know how hard she worked to save her family, and how willing she was to participate in the requirements of camp life in order to do that. These people like Etty Hillesum, who develop a reputation of being heroic figures, deserve to be considered heroic figures. But if you ever forget the kinds of evaluations and decisions they had to make in real time, then you really don't know who they are. Then you suddenly create an angel that walked the sidewalk of Westerbork, which was a complete lie. I mean, everybody who survived, almost everybody who survived, did so because they accepted some part of the reality they were faced with. That includes my father.
Because what's amazing about your father, he had a very good name.
Pardon?
Your father had a very good name.
Good name, right.
And I think in many cases there were people that were accomplices, or they were...
Right.
And their names, the word capo arrives, and
right.
And their names are... They were despised by a lot of the people or families that...
Right.
But your father retained a tremendously good name for himself. which is very unusual. It's very commendable.
Well, he had the good fortune of having developed, quote, a good reputation among the survivors. That's saying a lot.
It's a tremendous. It's
That's saying a lot. Because if you qualify it the way I just did,
it's very, very rare. What your father, it's very rare to have such a reputation being in such a situation.
right? But it's always, always, always at the edge of self-serving reputation. Always. Either at a conscious level or unconscious level. In comparison to other people who lived through and survived the Shoah, I think he never crossed the line. But he did attend meetings in Westerbork that included the heads of the camp. I mean, he was a second-tier bureaucrat in Westerbork. And with that came all kinds of opportunities to reject, to accept, to do whatever. And all I have as a son and as a historian, all I have really is a reputation that he had among the people who survived. But if you listen very carefully to those words, then it says nothing about his reputation in the real world of the camps. Because if you have to deal with the reputation of the people who survived, then they have a vested interest immediately to justify whatever they did. And one of the things I found very difficult, I still find it difficult, is those people who write about the Shoah or who talk about the Shoah who don't face the reality that people in the Shoah really faced. He survived. My father survived the Shoah. By his own words, he acknowledged that he was conscious of having survived. I never found a shred of evidence where he talks about himself as having survived because of what he felt he had to do as a barrack leader. I know, as a barrack leader, he cooperated at some level with the occupation. So, I know what you really have to do in order to evaluate that situation. Once you ask the question, why didn't he commit suicide in the face of everything that he was required to do? Then you can begin to appreciate the next steps.
positive outcomes. But what you're saying, it's very profound. It's very
Pardon?
it's very profound what you're saying about your father. It really is. He was faced with the most probably unbelievable situations that. But to come out of it with a positive reputation is unique. It's very, very rare and very unique.
I agree. And the reputation that he had among his fellow inmates, the reputation that Eddie Hillesum acquired, I mean, they point to individual behavior under extreme circumstances. That from a historian's perspective are noteworthy, really noteworthy. But they're not on the side of the angels. They're not on the side of the angels. And anybody who puts them on the side of the angels can do something that I can't do.
It's not being honest.
Right.
Good. Do you think because of
When you have Shoah memorials and you almost find yourself participating in a glorification of survivors, all survivors, then I at least find myself in the wrong place. I find myself in the wrong place. The opportunities of people to do what they did were unbelievably difficult. But at the same time, you have to recognize for many of them it became ordinary. I mean, a few years of knowing that tomorrow you can go on transport is a life-changing experience. And just because it's an experience that sometimes gets captured by a simple act doesn't make it any less complex. My father had a young friend in Westerbork whom I got to know quite well after the war. And he and I had a number of serious conversations. He was an observant Jew all his life. And in Camp Westerbork, he remained an observant Jew. So one of the reasons I know this is because the stories he told almost always included his tefillin. I can't remember him telling me stories that didn't include somewhere some reference where his tefillin were, or where they should have been, or something like that. And the reason that I remember these parts of my conversation with him is because on one occasion he told me about realizing the circumstances he was in as a young man, which meant in the case of our conversation on that particular day, we were talking about his particular moment of recognition that he might go on transport any minute. So the way he was telling me that he recognized as a young man that he could go and transport any minute is by making sure that he always had this feeling with him.
Do you recall his name? Do you remember his name?
Cohen. Cohen. No, I know I'm blocking on his name, but I'm sure I have it written down somewhere. Yeah. I got to know him very well after the war. He knew my father during the camp days very well. Hyman, Arthur Hyman. Arthur Hyman. Arthur Hyman. Jewish, German Jewish family. Loyal to the end. Loyal to the end. I got to know him years after, for a number of years after the war. I used to visit him and stuff.
And he spoke highly about your father?
Pardon?
He spoke highly about your father?
Oh yeah, oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. That's, I mean, to turn, I'm glad you raised that point. Every one of the people that I met who knew my father, perhaps they said the things they said because they knew he was my father. But every one of them wanted to make sure that I understood that among the people who were in leadership role, quasi-leadership role in this autonomous Jewish world, that he was different. He was different, that for him the Jewish component of his life was always uppermost, and that he never forgot who he was. Never forgot who he was. But that's also to say that he could live with what he had done and had to do. I mean, if you were a barrack leader in a concentration camp or transport camp like Vesterbork, if you were part of the machinery, you could talk to yourself until you were blue in the face that you always did it because that's a good way to help people. And no doubt that's true. But when you compare it to people who committed suicide because they didn't want to be touched by this evil, then you have to confront another issue and live with it.
Prof, can I ask you, because of your father's experience and because of your own experience, being a kindertransport, being a deportee, that you were arrested and you were deported to Poland, to the no man's land, did this have bearing on your desire to get involved in academia, to study history and to go down that path?
It must have.
So I think you went to Brooklyn College.
It must have. It must have. And but I can't remember exactly at which point, because I didn't become a professional historian because of the Shoah. No way. And I didn't become a professional historian because of my family's particular history. No way. No way. I became a professional historian because I really loved professional history. Not because I love Jewish history. Not at all. And when I did my dissertation and everything connected with it, it has nothing directly to do with my Shoah experience. It's almost, in retrospect, it's almost as if I had to do something else first before I could do the second. I mean, I had to establish myself as a legitimate professional historian in the ranks of historians by winning awards and doing all kinds of things. But I then came to decide, if I don't do this, who the hell is going to do it? And the it, this sounds very self-serving, but I think there's some truth in it. The it was, I did recognize at a certain point, and probably because of Elie Wiesel, that I could make a reasonable contribution for understanding some parts of the Shoah, perhaps better than other people could, or at least as good. And so I started to write that way.
Did you have a very close connection with Elie Wiesel?
Pardon?
Did you have a close connection with Elie Wiesel? Did you have a close connection with Elie Wiesel?
Oh, did I have a close relationship with Elie Wiesel? Yeah. Yes and no. Yes and no. From the time he first started publishing, I read him. And I attended a few events where he was the man of honor and talked. And we came to recognize each other, who we were. I mean, he knew what I had done, he knew what I tried to do, and I, of course, appreciated very much what he had done and what he tried to do. We met occasionally. We weren't personal friends, but at events of public nature, where he was speaking and I was in the audience attending, we always found a way of talking to each other, saying hello to each other and that sort of thing. And he actually helped me in publishing one of my pieces on the Shoah. I admired Wiesel a lot. And I admired him largely for the fact that he seemed always to retain his own integrity in terms of being the kind of survivor that he was. He was a very unusual survivor. And he remained, I think, a right-wing Orthodox Jew all his life. I think there's some things he wrote where he raises questions about this sort of stuff. But, and it's true, he knew how to exploit his own experience to give him an enormous reputation, all deserved. And I admired him enormously because of his courage to speak out the way he did. Because when he started to speak out, this wasn't the way you get medals for heroism. That only came much later. I mean, when he started to speak out, I mean, a good portion of the Jewish population probably felt embarrassed. Because they were trying to put all that behind them. And here came this young man who said, no, you can't do that. And I've got the life to help me prove why you can't do that. And so far as I know, his reputation was never marked by anything negative. I'm sure some people think there are some negative to what he did and how he exploited his particular position. But I admired Elie Wiesel.
So good. It's interesting. You were at Brooklyn College, and then from there you went on to Madison in Wisconsin, and you got your PhD in '59.
Right.
And then you spent time, and then eventually you came to you went to Cornell University. And on your journey, and when you started writing about I think it was in '65, about the Shoah, how did your colleagues react to you writing about the Holocaust?
Say again?
How did your colleagues react to you delving in and writing and exposing the Holocaust? Because it wasn't so popular in those days as it wasn't when Elie Wiesel started.
Some thought I was crazy. Absolutely crazy. Most of my colleagues at Cornell, in particular, weren't very interested in what I was doing.
Does this include Jewish colleagues as well?
Oh yeah, weren't very interested. Some were, a couple were. But that's because of who they were to begin with. One was Milton Convitz. I mean, he was a man of really significant academic stature. And he had a profound position in Jewish intellectual circles as well. Partly because his rabbinic family had a whole reputation in certain segmented circles. But no, in terms of my secular colleagues, I presented a problem because I began publishing about the Shoah as if it was a genuine historical subject, which deserved the same respect as any other area. And for most of my career, that did not happen. It took quite a while before the Shoah, as a legitimate historical subject, was generally accepted by other historians. And some of my colleagues who did that deserve so much credit for what they did and how they did it, and against the stream which they worked. American historians weren't on the forefront of making sure that the world knew about the Holocaust. There were very few historians like me who were quite willing to put their careers at risk by dealing with this subject. Don't misunderstand me. This only means that most mainstream historians expect you to be mainstream and not parochial. And if you happen to do it, if your parochial passions went towards Jews, that was a kind of parochialism that really shouldn't be part of the history profession. It took quite a long time before that changed. Quite a long time. And I don't think really it was the study of the Shoah that broke the back to this kind of quasi-isolation. I think it was what African American historians did, because for years African American history was in the hands of so few people. I was very fortunate because one of my professors was John Hope Franklin. I was one of his teaching assistants for a while. And John Hope was a great pioneer in African American history. And partly as a result of that, I knew a lot about African American history and completely aware of the confinement that white American historians required really when they came to African American history. It took a tragic number of years for students of African American history to prove how central they were to the understanding of all American history. And this wasn't just, I mean, in my judgment, this wasn't just a matter of saying, well, these are Johnny-come-latelys, you know, first you worry about Catholic Americans and then Protestant Americans and then subsets of these people, and yeah, Jewish historians, and okay, everyone knew about African American historians. I mean, some of my friends and buddies in graduate school were great pioneers in writing African American history in ways that my teacher, John Hope Franklin, hadn't begun with when he started. And it reached a point where those fine scholars in African American history began to win the day in really demonstrating to the profession, never mind the readers, but to the profession, that you can't do American history without putting without putting African Americans in its center. You can't do it. But they had to come along and prove it. They did. And they did. I mean, I can rattle off a few names, some of whom were my friends in graduate school. I mean, one, for example, who most people don't know about is Herbert Gutman. Herbert Gutman
Bye-bye.
was a Jewish boy from New York. But like a number of those guys, they turned to the study of African American history long before it became fashionable. Long before. Which meant they risked an enormous amount. And it was only because they had sufficient trust in their own abilities and capacities that they persevered. I mean, there were some great historians that came out of the modern writing of African American history, and their achievement is really, to my mind, astounding. Astounding, because they had a profession that didn't want to touch them. I mean, I think it was much worse than the Jewish historians. We had our share of that, but what they had to overcome, and what they did overcome, and then of course once having overcome it, having to start with the problem of how much empowerment does success give you.
But there are similarities with what you did with the Shoah.
Pardon?
There are similarities with you writing about the Shoah, which was also not so popular at the time, and was also, it wasn't the norm to write about the Holocaust and to bring that to the forefront. That wasn't...
Say again?
It wasn't the norm, what you did either.
Uh-huh.
Writing about the Holocaust, it wasn't the accepted thing to do in those days.
Oh, no. That's right. That's right. And I mean, I paid a price for it. Because when I started to write about this stuff, it was considered to be quite parochial, maybe even super parochial. And fortunately, we had some great historians who got into the subject, you know, like Friedlander and others, that today I think there are not so many historians who consider the Holocaust more a matter of Jewish imagination rather than part of a secular subject. That was always my dream, to make the Holocaust, to participate in a trend to make the Holocaust an integral part of American history. Integral part.
And world history as well?
Oh yeah, right, of course. But I was an American historian, and contrary to most American historians, almost all of American historians, the Shoah is not a subject of American history. At least it wasn't some years ago. I haven't checked the temperature lately. But fortunately, there were colleagues in Shoah history who did such beautiful work that you just couldn't ignore it.
So there were people like Raoul Hilberg. Did you have a personal connection? He
Yes,
wrote
I did.
The Destruction of European Jewry.
I did. I was one of his early reviewers. And he was a very, very talented man. Very complicated and very courageous. Very courageous. I mean, he wrote against Jewish streams of opinion and non-Jewish streams of opinion. He did what he wanted to do. He put a secular version of the Shoah on the historian's bookshelf. He like many a pioneer, you know, there were problems with some of the stuff he did. And he was followed by scholars who were much better educated to the subject than he was. Hilberg was never educated in Jewish sources as some people who followed Hilberg. But, I mean, you can't discuss the historians' literature of the Holocaust without talking about Hilberg. I mean, I think I wrote some of the early reviews, or maybe portions of a review talked about Hilberg.
And Prof, you knew Raoul Hilberg personally?
Yeah. Yeah, I did because I got to know him personally because I was on one of the early panels of the American Historical Association that dealt with Hilberg's book. And I met him a few times, but we never became close at all.
You also had a connection with Hannah Arendt. I think she wanted to see one of your papers before you were giving a lecture. She asked if she could meet with you.
Pardon?
She asked if she could meet with you.
She wanted?
She asked if she could meet with you. She wanted to...
Oh. Yeah. I'm trying to remember how that all worked out, but she became aware of my work on the Shoah long after I became aware of hers.
And her book, Achman in Jerusalem,
Right.
and the
bigger book,
Analyty of Evil.
right,
She was very controversial. It was a very...
right. But I was very flattered by the time she contacted me. I didn't contact her. and she wanted very much to know what I was doing and where I was going. And I think I disappointed her, because she listened to me for a while, and that included an explanation that I could never become a real historian of the Shoah, that I had all kinds of hang-ups preventing me from doing that. So I remember so vividly at one point she said to me, so you're going to leave the subject the way you found it. You know, that's a classic line historians use about each other. And I said, yes, I think that's true. That's true. She, I met her on one or two occasions, very private. She was very generous with her time. I admired her a lot. She was quite something. And we shared a little bit in our backgrounds. I mean, she had a European background, I had a European background. That's about the end of it. I mean, she became this great intellectual and scholar, which is something I didn't become.
No, you did, and I just want to mention, you became, your book that you...
Pardon?
The book that you, the Hunter and the Hunted,
oh, yes.
which you compiled, and which was published by Viking, and I think you had B'nai Brit. They
Right.
sponsored as well. But if you look at the contributors who wrote articles in the book, it's incredible. The names.
That's all the doing of
Davidovich.
the two people who were the editors of a number of series.
Lucy Davidovich, right?
No.
Wasn't she one of the editors of the
David
series?
Patterson and Lily
Oh, right, Lily
Edelman of B'nai Brit. They pushed me very hard to publish that book.
But this, in my opinion, is the gold standard.
Pardon?
This is the gold standard on the Shoah. It really is. You have Elie Wiesel, who has essays in the book. You have Simon Wiesenthal.
Pardon?
Simon Wiesenthal also has an essay in this book. You have Raoul Hilberg. You have the most amazing historians. And if you look at the contents and what you put together, it's incredible. It's the whole gamut of the Shoah.
Right.
And
Well,
you know,
it was the beginning of a trend. I mean, other great historians have really great historians have come along and written, not anthologies like this, but really written part of the history of the Shoah. So.
and how was the book received when it was published?
Oh, I think quite well. It took a while for anything you published on the Shoah to develop a reputation. I mean, if you wanted to make a great reputation in history, you didn't do it by doing the history of the Shoah. That came later.
But that's why you were one of the pioneers.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. At least at a certain level I was, yeah. I think I was at the level where I brought the Shoah to the attention of a lot of readers.
And I think you have one of the most amazing essays in the book was by Max Korman. You have the essay by Max Korman. There's an essay on being a refugee.
Yeah.
By Max Korman.
Max Korman,
Yeah,
right.
which is amazing.
Right.
And I think I've just gone through some of the essays, but it's just absolutely
Right.
unbelievable, these essays.
Right.
And it's coming from a personal,
Right.
it's very personal.
Right.
Every essay
Right.
has a personal connection.
Yeah, right.
And having had, your connection, did you have a close connection with Simon Wiesenthal?
Pardon?
Did you have a close connection with Simon Wiesenthal?
No.
But he contributed an essay in the book as well.
Yeah.
And you had met him?
No. The hunter,
He has Steps Beyond the Grave. He contributed a...
no, I never met him. No.
And then, Prof, can I just ask you, you also, on your sabbatical, you spent time in Tel Aviv University, in the history department in Tel Aviv University.
Right.
Did you have connections with the different Holocaust museums in Israel, with Yad Vashem?
I did.
And
I did. But as far as they were concerned, I was a minor figure in all this. It was partly because I insisted on coming at the subject as an American historian. And that was and remains quite different from coming at it as a Jewish historian or a especially trained Holocaust historian. I mean, when I began, there was no such thing as a Holocaust historian, right?
there wasn't.
No, right. And I didn't consider myself a Holocaust historian. I don't think I ever will either. And in prizes and competition for prestige, I'm not a participant. I'm really not a participant. I mean, the field of Holocaust studies has really developed some marvelous figures.
You included, no question about it.
Pardon?
Prof, you are right at the top on that list. There's no question about it.
Well,
But in Israel, did you have a connection with Yehuda Bauer?
yes, I did. He and I had superficial connections, but we had connections because I interviewed Bauer at the beginning of his career.
Prof, you had a connection with Lucy Davidovich?
Yeah. I can't remember how often I met her or when. I don't remember.
She was one of the early historians.
What?
She was one of the early, also, writers
yeah.
about the Shoah.
Yeah. Right. But I didn't relate to Lucy Davidovich that way. I related to her more through her connection to David Patterson. And David Patterson was the head of the Oxford Center for Jewish Studies. David Patterson became a very dear friend of mine because David had a 1 year or a 2 year appointment in Jewish Studies at Cornell. So while he was here, we became friends. And he was extraordinarily entrepreneurial as an academic. I never was. But David surely was. And he got to know the people we were just talking about, largely because of David Patterson. David Patterson, he was an extraordinary man. It's almost as if he carried Oxford on his shoulders for everybody to see. And yet, he was Jewish to his fingertips. I mean, classic English Jew. And he was a dear friend. I got to know his wife. Dear friend.
And did you know...
And he brought me to Oxford.
You taught in Oxford?
Yeah, I did. He brought me to Oxford. So I taught for a semester in Oxford.
And Prof, did you know Sir Martin Gilbert?
Pardon?
Did you know Sir Martin Gilbert?
I met him once or twice. Yes, I did. Yeah, amazing guy.
Because he was a remarkable historian as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to make sure I'm not confusing people, but I think I'm mixing him up with somebody else. Having been at Cornell through this entire stretch, gave me a special opportunity to meet all kinds of people who came to Ithaca not because of me, but because of Cornell.
And also because of you.
Yeah, right. And those were the connections I made with David Patterson. He taught for a while at Cornell, 1 year, I think. And that was the year, I think, maybe before or after, I became the acting chair of the Jewish Studies Department at Cornell. So, for the time that I became acting chair of the Jewish Studies Department, I made some pretty significant contacts with people who I was trying to get to come to Cornell, to visit, etc., etc. One of the people who became really dear friends was Itamar Rabinovich. Itamar Rabinovich came to Cornell as an academic from Tel Aviv University. And then, of course, he became the important statesman for the state of Israel. And we remained in contact all those years in one way or another. Marvelous scholar, marvelous teacher. And I was acting chair of the Jewish Studies Department at Cornell for a while. But you shouldn't get the wrong idea. I was acting chair because the department early on wasn't really a department. So by the time I got into it, it had become a contentious place. And so for all intents and purposes, I was acting chair. I became acting chair. And the reason I became acting chair is because I was outside of the Jewish Studies Department. I wasn't a member of the Jewish Studies Department, I was outside. And the people in the Jewish Studies Department worked very hard to become part of the central hierarchy of Cornell University. Eventually they succeeded. But my engagement with the Jewish Studies Department at Cornell, for a short time became quite serious. Initially, I became connected to it only because there were a whole bunch of us who took an interest in what they were doing, and so we joined with others who were in the department of, I forget what they call themselves now, but that was really a department that was anchored in the Arts College. And at one point, this group of people got into some idiotic academic hassles. And I don't have the names at my fingertips. The guy who was running the chair, who was acting chair of the Jewish Studies Department, got into a terrible, nasty little fight with his colleagues in the department. He was in the history department, and he was flown in to become the chair of the Jewish Studies Department. And his claim to fame was that he was a professor of ancient history, not of Jewish history. And I found myself playing the role of some kind of diplomat, I don't know, between people like Bernstein from the history department and people like
But Prof, you navigated and you acted as a diplomat and you made the peace between.
Right. Well, I don't know if I was a successful diplomat. All I know is that Bernstein, who was an ancient historian in the history department at Cornell, for a couple of years was running Jewish studies. And at a certain point I became acting chair of Jewish studies, which was a little odd because I was in the INLR school, and you know, the Arts College people were very proud of not being part of New York State's Cornell place. Albany played an enormous role in Cornell University, at Cornell University. It's made up of two parts, a public part and a private part. The public part includes the Arts School of Agriculture, the Industrial and Labor Relations School like my own, and I forget, maybe one or two others. So it had a weighty position. But the people in the Arts College considered themselves a prestigious group, always. And it was always a very interesting relationship in dealing with them. So I became chair of the Hebrew Studies Department only because they couldn't find anybody else.
No, I think they went.
So they couldn't find an
Very
insider.
modest.
They couldn't find an insider, so they brought in this outsider. Right.
And how long did you hold that position?
Me? I was acting chair of the Hebrews. No, not Hebrew studies, it goes something.
Jewish studies.
Jewish studies. For about a year or two, maybe. It was all understood. I was just being flown in to do the paperwork. And it was a nasty experience. It really was a nasty experience. I should never have accepted it. I should never have done that. But because up to that point, I never had direct dealings with the cat and dog fights of academics that are not unusual. But the Jewish Studies group, I think, had a monopoly
Oui.
on the worst kind
Oui.
of internal battles, because they invariably involved very petty issues, most of which I now forget, and it seemed really to be either totally uninterested
Sure.
in doing the right thing, or
But Prof, can I ask you, when you were there at Cornell,
Pardon?
did you ever come into contact with David Wyman?
David
Wyman.
from
He wrote a non-Jewish professor, and he wrote the
at Cornell?
American professor.
No.
But he wrote about the abandonment of the jury in America. His monumental work was the abandonment of the Jews by David Wyman. Did you ever get to meet with him? David Wyman?
I know. I'm
Because he was a very serious academic.
he was. I know. He yeah.
And Prof, did you ever meet with David Kranzler?
Pardon?
Did you ever get to know David Kranzler?
David?
Kranzler. He was also a religious historian. Who, David Kranzler.
David
Kranzler.
Kranzlet?
Kranzler. He wrote. Was about Japan and Sugihara and the visas. He was an expert in that field. David Kranzler.
At Cornell?
Not at Cornell, but he was an American professor.
Oh, no, I don't think I knew him.
He also wrote about Jews saving Jews, and very, very special professor. And did you ever get to meet Isaac Lewin?
Pardon?
Did you ever get to meet Isaac Lewin from Yeshiva University? Isaac Lewin. Isaac Lewin?
No. Isaac, no. I don't
He
think
was
so.
a professor at Yeshiva University.
Yeah.
Did you have any contact with Yeshiva University?
I did. I had, I forget now, but for some reason or another, I once had some dealings with the guy who was head of the Jewish Studies Department at Yeshiva University. But in general, no, I didn't. No. I really was parachuted in to manage unruly academics who were part of this Jewish Studies group. I mean, the historians didn't like the other historians, and there were petty fights going on in the Jewish, in the Arts College section of the department.
Prof,
So they couldn't get anybody else in, so they brought me in,
But Prof,
complete outsider. So I got into this department as acting chair, and the very first thing I did was to call everybody in one at a time. There weren't so many. And I took detailed notes of our interview. And then I gave the written version to the people there. And I asked them to sign it to make sure that they agreed this was the truth. And I did all that to emphasize that I knew that this department was so dominated by lousy lies and misrepresentations that unless I could establish some kind of baseline, I mean, there were just leaves flying in the storm. So, yeah.
But
I should have had my head examined for doing this.
Prof, on a more positive note,
I want you to appreciate what this involved. I was a professor of the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations, where I taught American labor history and related subjects. And my related subjects included Jewish labor history. I put Jewish labor history on the map in these departments at Cornell, just for a short time. Nothing deep institutional, just a short time. And in that position, when the Jewish Studies group needed a chair, the powers that be who knew me included Milton Convitz. And Milton Convitz had always had a big, powerful hand in the Jewish Studies field, rightfully so. So they engineered the steps by which I became the acting head of Cornell's Jewish Studies department. Or in other words, they couldn't get anybody else.
I'm sure they wanted the best.
That's right. That's right. So here's this professor of industrial labor relations, he's also head of the Semitics department at Cornell University. But it worked. I mean, I cleaned house for a while.
Prof, could you mention, and it's such a positive, you wrote the most amazing, it's called the Survivor's Talmud. Could you tell us a little bit about that, because this is so intriguing.
You read it, I take it.
Ezra sent me a copy.
Huh?
Ezra, your son, sent me a copy.
So you read it?
I've read part of it, but could you tell us a little bit about what got you involved in this project?
Well, it was an accident. It was really an accident. I knew absolutely nothing about this Survivor's Talmud. And then one day, I was in the office. I was in the office of a guy who had been chair of the Jewish Studies world in Cornell, the father of Bibi Netanyahu. So I walked into this office. By the time I was walking into the office, I was acting chair. He had been chair for quite a while. Now I was acting chair. So I was checking on the offices to see what was left. You know? And all of a sudden I see a shas, a bookshelf. There are no other books in the room, just this lonely shas. And I looked at him. I'm not a Talmud scholar at all. So I opened the first page in one of the volumes, and I was literally blown away, because that first page had a sketch of a presumed concentration camp on the inside cover. So I remember in this empty office, empty bookcase, I sat myself down and I went through the pages of some of the volumes. And it turned out that each volume had the same kind of introduction, and each one had this graphic representation of a concentration camp. So I made it my business to try to find out what the heck was this, because I had no idea what it was. So I checked with the National Archives, I checked with all the right places. And by the time I finished checking, I had enough to do an article. I think it's one of the best pieces I ever wrote. Because, I don't know why, but it forced me to learn a lot about this event and what it represented. I still think to this day it's an ordinary, extraordinary event to have the United States Army publish a survivor's Talmud. I mean, it only became a survivor's Talmud because they published a Talmud. I called it a survivor's Talmud. I don't think they called it a survivor's Talmud. But I was very proud of bringing that to the attention of people.
And do you know how many volumes they published?
Pardon?
Do you know how many volumes were published?
Of what? Talmud? No, I don't recall exactly. But it was a few. It was a few. And I was once curious about that very question, but I can't recall now what I found. Not too many editions, right? And I think I gave it more publicity with my article than anything else I would give it publicity. But the fact that I found it sitting by itself in an empty bookcase in an abandoned, in a former office of a Israeli scholar, Netanyahu, tells you everything. Tells you everything. Anyway, that's how I felt. I was hurt. I was really hurt to realize that they took this shas and let it sit in an empty bookcase, sort of abandoned. And that was the doings of Netanyahu's father. He was chair. And you know, he was a very, very knowledgeable historian.
He wrote a lot on the Marranos. He wrote a lot about the Jews of Portugal and the Marranos.
Right. Very knowledgeable about many things. But obviously this was nothing for him. This was some books that had to be gotten rid of. I may be very unfair, but that's what I thought at the time. I didn't understand how. Once I understood what I was looking at, I couldn't understand how one of the members of that department could treat these volumes as if they had no value at all. And anyway, that's the backdrop for my having written that article. And American Jewish History was very kind that Feingold took it, the editor, and made it the lead article in the issue at that time. Yeah. I think it was one of the best pieces of work I ever did.
It is incredible. It really is.
It's really a little bit of a detective story.
It's an amazing article. It's really unbelievable. Prof, can I ask, how do you feel, having been one of the preeminent scholars in the field, but in the early field, as a pioneer, and now today you go to any bookshop anywhere in the world really, and you'll see a lot of books written about the Shoah. Today it's become quite popular in a way.
Right.
It must give you a lot of, I don't know.
No, it does.
Do you feel good that you were one of the forerunners?
I don't have I don't have this kind of identity, because I know that what I did gets pigeonholed, and the much larger achievements dominate, right? I mean, you're interested, it's lovely and it's important, and maybe one year some other people will get to take a serious interest in it. I thought at the time that I did that article on the Survivors Talmud, it was a terribly important story to tell because of what the American Army did and how they did it and how the whole event was handled. It encapsulates so much, post-war recognition and post-war disregard, both at the same time. But yeah.
And Prof, I just have to ask you, having witnessed so much and having been an eyewitness to the Shoah, you were part of it, and then having written about it and seeing the progression and seeing what's happening today, what is your message about what's happening today or what happened in the past? And you see similarities, what's going on. Do you see similarities? And what are your fears for the future or your hopes for the future?
It's very hard for me to talk about it because it's so wrapped up with my personal affairs. So part of me is terribly disappointed, because, like so many other people, if you were there in 1948, and so quickly came to realize this remains an eternal problem in world history, world event. It's enough to make you bitter. It's enough to make you bitter. And the only thing that prevents me from being bitter is to fully appreciate what Israel has done, achieved and accomplished. And every once in a while I tell myself that's the primary reason why so many people are still going after it. They can't let it thrive by itself. But that's not a scholarly impression. That's just the impression of a guy who's very angry at the world for not giving Israel the space it deserved. I mean, every achievement that Israel has acquired, I think it had to get with claws and stuff. And it no doubt that also happened or happens because of the way Israelis handle themselves. Probably. No idea, really. But from the little I know about the history of nation states, some of all of this is understandable, but for me all of it isn't. Just isn't. And how and why the wars that Israel has fought haven't been resolved, let's say, the way German and French wars were resolved. It's very, very painful. It's very painful because, you know, the historian in me always looks for the other side of the problem. And I've always seen many of the other sides. And Israel isn't always on the side of the angels, for sure not. But for Israel to remain accused for having committed an original sin for existing is just beyond my rational belief. I find myself coming ever closer to some relatives of mine in Milwaukee used to say, when I had a conversation with them as a young graduate student, "You don't understand Jewish enemies." Maybe that's true. I don't know. I find it very hard. I find it very hard to look at Israel in the same way as I can look at other countries. And it's not because I'm committed to Israel. That's not why. I just find it very difficult that the driving elements of the animosity towards Israel must rest ultimately in this continued opposition to Jewish existence. I find that I'm not bringing this Columbus to America, right? I just find it very difficult. I know a little bit about German-French relations. And at a certain point in their relationship, you would never expect them to come to terms with each other. And I know a little bit about the relationship with some other country with each other. But this relationship between Jews and their neighbors runs against all of the currents. And, you know, on the one hand, it's easiest for me to just blame it on basic anti-Semitism that's viral and it pops up all over. And fundamentally, that's really what's involved in the relationship to Jews. But it's so overlain with secular national politics. It's very difficult for me to continually to come back to the original beginnings, right? It's almost as if I hear the voice of an elderly uncle. You don't understand. The world doesn't like Jews, period. I mean, how many times did I hear him say that to me? And of course I couldn't accept it. I still have trouble accepting it. But the evidence is so overwhelming. So I have to recognize that even if you could arrange for a peace treaty between whatever Arab states exist or rebel groups exist, it's not going away. The tension is not going away. And so long as Israel remains militarily strong enough to defend itself, we can go on sleeping at night. But part of me has always said for a long time now, we may deserve a lot as Jews, but this we don't deserve. This we don't deserve. And if the Rabbanu Shalom really has certain departments that deal with these issues, then at the least they need tranquilizers.
I think you said it so well, Prof. You said it so well. So, Prof, I just want to thank you. It's going to be one. So, Prof, there are no words. Really, there are really no words to tell you how much I so appreciate not only your wisdom, but just being in your presence. It's been the biggest honor and privilege, really. I think you are extraordinary. And I think every position that you obtained, you deserve. Every position that you ever obtained, you deserved it. And they were looking for the best, and they got the best. And it's been such an honor and a privilege to be here. And you should just have mazel and bracha, and please God, the end of the war, and just to have peace in our towns and better days.
Right.
But thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you.
Really, I really, really appreciate it, Prof.
Mm.